The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. It was a raw, high sound that ripped through the cracks of the Redemption Gap saloon, carrying the sting of ice and the promise of a deeper, more brutal cold to come. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, stale whiskey, and the lie of warmth. For Rosalie Thorne, it was the air of a cage. Her lip was split, the copper taste of her own blood sharp on her tongue. The side of her face throbbed with a dull, rising heat where Macklin had struck her, his heavy ring leaving a mark that matched the one on her dignity. Tomorrow, she was to be his wife. Tomorrow, the preacher's orphaned daughter, sold off by the town elders to settle a mining debt they claimed her father owed, would belong to the man who owned the saloon, the gambling, and half the souls in town. He was laughing now, a wet, choking sound from the back room. He was showing her off, his new property. Terror, cold and sharp, cut through the pain. She would not. Her hands, shoved into the pockets of her thin, gray dress, were shaking so hard she could barely feel her fingers. It was now or never. He was drunk. They were all drunk. The storm was her only ally. She didn't look back. She slipped through the kitchen, past a startled cook, and into the narrow alley where the saloon's refuse was piled high. The wind hit her like a fist, stealing her breath and plastering the dress to her thin frame. Snow was already ankle-deep, a blinding white curtain in the moonless dark. The stable was just across the street, a darker shadow in the gloom. She ran, her worn boots slipping on the forming ice, her lungs burned. She wasn't a thief, not by nature, but she would be tonight. She fumbled with the latch on the stable door, her frozen fingers clumsy and stupid. It finally gave, and she fell inside. The smell of hay and animal warmth, a shocking comfort. She didn't pick a horse. She took the first one, a big bay gelding that shifted nervously in its stall. Macklin's horse. Good, let him walk. Her hands, raw with cold, fought the bridle. She'd ridden all her life, but never like this. Never with the feeling of a noose tightening around her neck. She managed the bit, hauled the saddle onto its back, and pulled the cinch as tight as her trembling arms would allow. She let it out, the horse snorting at the storm. She pulled herself up, her body aching, and kicked its ribs. The horse lunged, and they were gone, swallowed by the blizzard before the laughter from the saloon had even faded. She rode north, away from the valley, up into the high country. The trail was already vanishing. The wind drove needles of ice into her face, and the cut on her lip began to bleed again, freezing on her chin. She had no coat, no food, no plan. She had only the desperate animal instinct to flee. The horse was strong, but she was pushing it too hard, demanding more than the night or the trail would allow. The snow deepened, climbing the horse's legs, turning its powerful strides into a weary, high-stepping plunge. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time dissolved into a rhythm of wind screams and the horse's labored breathing. She could no longer feel her feet. Her hands were numb clubs on the reins. The cold had crept under her skin, into her bones, slowing her blood and her thoughts. She was dying. The thought was distant, almost peaceful. At least she would not be his. The horse stumbled, catching itself with a heaving groan. It stumbled again, and this time it went down, its legs folding. The animal was spent. It lay in the snow, flanks shuddering, too tired to even try to rise. Rosalie fell clear, landing in a deep drift that felt, for a 1-second mercy, like a feather bed. She tried to get up. Her legs wouldn't answer. She crawled, pulling herself through the snow, not knowing where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. The bleeding from her lip had stopped, but a deeper, internal bleeding of warmth was draining her. She was so very tired. She pulled herself under the low-hanging branches of a massive pine, the snow shallower there. She curled into a ball, trying to shelter her face from the wind. The world went soft, the edges blurring from white to gray. She thought she heard her father singing a hymn, faint and far away. Then, the darkness took her. Seth McCrae found her 2 hours after dawn. The storm had broken. leaving behind a world scoured clean and buried in white. He was checking his trap lines, moving with a silence that was part of his Cheyenne blood. His steps light on snowshoes. He saw the horse first, a dark mound already dusted with new snow, its breath a faint plume in the frigid air. It was dead, froze solid. He spat, disgusted. Only a fool or a coward would ride a horse to death in a blizzard. He'd seen the tracks coming up from the valley, tracks he'd followed out of a grim curiosity. He figured it was a drunk prospector or a new arrival idiot who didn't know the mountains. Then he saw the second, smaller mound under the pine. He approached it slowly, rifle held easy in the crook of his arm. He nudged the shape with his boot. It was a woman, or a girl. It was hard to tell. She was frozen stiff, her face blue-white, a dark, frozen stain of blood on her chin. His first thought was to leave her. It was none of his business. The mountains took what they took. He had his own ghosts, and he didn't need another. He was a half-breed, a man who lived between worlds and belonged to neither. The townsfolk down in Redemption Gap scorned him for his Cheyenne mother, and the tribe would have nothing to do with him for his outlaw white father. He lived on silence and pain, and that was how he liked it. He grumbled under his breath, a mix of English and Cheyenne curses. "Not my trouble." He turned to walk away. He took 2 steps. He stopped. He looked back at the small, frozen shape. He saw the dark, ugly bruise spreading from her hairline down to her cheekbone, a violent purple against the marble of her skin. It wasn't the mountain that had done this. It was a man. Something in him, a piece of rusted metal deep in his gut, scraped and moved. He'd spent his life watching violence, suffering it and running from it. He was tired of it. With a sigh that turned to smoke, he went back. He lifted her. She weighed nothing, a bundle of ice and rags. He pulled the buffalo robe from his own back and wrapped her in it, then hefted her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. It was a long, hard walk back to his cabin, his snowshoes sinking deep with the added weight. He ignored the burning in his thighs and the new voice in his head, the one that kept repeating, "Fool, fool, fool." His cabin was high up, tucked into a cleft of rock and pine, invisible from below. It was one room, built of sturdy logs he'd cut himself, chinked with mud and moss. It was a fortress against the world. He kicked the door open and carried her inside. The air was warm, thick with the smell of wood smoke, pine, and curing rabbit pelts that hung from the rafters. He laid her on his cot, the only piece of furniture besides a rough table and a single chair. The cot was a simple frame, stretched with deer hide and piled with furs. He worked quickly, his movements economical and sure. He built the fire up in the stone hearth until it roared, driving the deep cold from the room. Then he turned to her. Her clothes were frozen to her skin. He took his hunting knife, the blade sharp enough to shave with, and carefully slit the gray dress up the back, peeling the frozen fabric away from her skin. He did the same with her underthings. He worked with a clinical detachment, his face hard, turning his head away from her nakedness. He saw the map of bruises on her back, old and new, and the muscles in his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He covered her immediately with his heaviest buffalo robe, tucking it tight around her. He filled a pot with snow and set it to melt, adding a handful of bitter herbs from a leather pouch, his mother's medicine. For 3 days, Rosalie drifted. She was aware of heat, then a numbing cold that shook her to the core, then heat again. She felt rough hands holding her head, forcing a bitter, hot liquid down her throat. She heard a low voice, grunting, but the words made no sense. She was in a dark place, a place of shadows and pain, and she fought to stay there. When she finally woke, the first thing she saw was the light. It was a single, dusty beam, cutting through the gloom of the cabin from a small, greased paper window. The second thing she saw was him. He was sitting at the table, his back to her, sharpening his knife. The sound was a rhythmic, abrasive shing 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 that set her teeth on edge. He was big, broader than she'd realized, his shoulders filling out the worn flannel shirt. His hair was long, black, and tied back with a leather thong. Fear, immediate and suffocating, seized her. She was trapped. She'd escaped Macklin only to be caught by someone else. A wild man, a mountain man. She tried to sit up, to run. A wave of dizziness and weakness so profound hit her that she fell back, a small, involuntary groan escaping her. The Shing stopped. He didn't turn around. Not right away. He simply sat there, his head cocked, listening. Then, slowly, he stood. He was taller than she'd thought, too. He turned, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. It was not a kind face. It was carved from granite, all hard angles and flat planes. A scar, white and jagged, ran from his left eyebrow to his jaw. His eyes were dark, and they held no welcome. He was Seth McCrae, though she didn't know his name. He was the half-breed the townsfolk whispered about, the ghost of the high country. She shrank back into the furs, pulling the heavy robe up to her chin, her knuckles white. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He walked to the hearth, picked up a wooden bowl from the mantel, and ladled something into it from a black pot hanging over the fire. He walked to the cot and held it out. "Eat," he said. His voice was a low-timbered gravel, unused. She stared at the bowl. It was a thick stew, steaming, and it smelled of rabbit and wild onion. Her stomach clenched in a spasm of hunger so violent it hurt. But she didn't move. She just stared at him, her eyes wide with terror. He sighed, an impatient sound. He set the bowl on the small crate next to the cot. "Eat," he said again, more firmly. "Or don't, but I won't waste my heat on a corpse." He went back to his table, but he didn't pick up the knife. He began mending a tear in a canvas pack, his large, scarred hands surprisingly deft with the needle and thread. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. Rosalie's hunger finally won. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the bowl, but she drank the stew. It was hot and savory, and the best thing she had ever tasted. When it was gone, she felt a sliver of strength return. She looked at him. He was still sewing, ignoring her. Where am I?" she whispered. Her voice was a dry croak. He didn't look up. "My cabin." "Who? Are you?" He paused his sewing. "Seth." He offered nothing else. The silence returned, heavier this time. The days that followed were a quiet, agonizing tension. The storm that had saved her now trapped her. The snow was piled high against the door, and the wind never seemed to stop. Seth would go out for hours, checking his traps, and she would be alone, her fear a living thing in the small room. But the worst was when he was there. He said almost nothing. He worked constantly, chopping more wood, curing the pelts, cleaning his rifle until it gleamed. He moved with a restless, contained energy. A predator paced in a cage too small. Rosalie was terrified of him. He was the biggest, most dangerous-looking man she had ever seen. But as the days turned into a week, a strange, new feeling began to creep in beneath the fear. He never, not once, looked at her with the greedy, appraising stare she had come to expect from men. His gaze was distant, impersonal. When he saw she was awake, he would leave a bowl of stew or a piece of hard bannock bread by the cot and go outside to chop wood, no matter how hard the wind blew. When she was finally strong enough to use the chamber pot hidden behind a small screen of hides, she would wait until he was outside, her body rigid with shame and fear. One day, he returned early. She froze, her face burning with humiliation. He didn't even glance her way. He simply turned his back, facing the fire, and began to stir the pot, his shoulders a rigid, protective wall between them until she was finished and hidden back under the furs. He left a basin of warm water and a clean rag by her bed. "You need to wash," he grunted, and then he left the cabin, staying gone for over an hour, long after the water had grown cold. He never asked her name. He never asked how she came to be half dead in the snow. He never asked about the bruises that were fading from yellow to a sickly green, or the scars, old and new, that littered her body. His silence was a kindness sharper than any question. It was a gift A space where she didn't have to be the preacher's daughter or Macklin's property. She could just be. The weather held them captive. As her strength returned, she began to see the man, not the monster. She watched him one evening, sitting by the fire, mending her boots. They were ruined, the leather split and frozen. She had thought them lost. He was working bear grease into the hide, his movement slow and methodical. He used a piece of sinew and a thick awl to stitch the sole back to the upper. It was rough work, but it was strong. When he was finished, he tossed them by the cot. They were ugly, but they were whole. Her fever broke on the 9th day. She woke from a long, sweat-soaked sleep, the furs clinging to her. Her hair was a matted, tangled mess. She felt weak, but clear-headed. Seth saw her struggling to lift her arms, trying to comb her fingers through the knots. He put down the trap he was mending. "Sit," he commanded. She froze as he came toward her. He had a rough wooden comb in his hand. He sat on the edge of the cot, and she flinched, but he only turned her so her back was to him. "Be still," he said, his voice low. He took her hair in his hand and began to comb. He started at the ends, gently, working his way up. His touch was firm, careful, and utterly impersonal. He worked through the tangles one by one, his knuckles occasionally brushing her neck. His fingers were calloused and warm. Rosalie sat rigid, her eyes squeezed shut. It was the longest, most intimate, and most terrifyingly gentle touch she had ever known from a man. She wanted to weep. When he was done, her hair fell in a smooth, clean sheet down her back. He simply stood up and went back to his work, as if nothing had happened. She tried to get up the next day, her legs shaking. I should help," she stammered, grabbing the table for support. He put a hand on her shoulder, his grip like a steel band, and pushed her back down onto the cot. It wasn't rough, but it was absolute. "You'll help by getting strong," he growled. "Fool girl, sit." The scolding was gruff, but it lacked the mean edge of Macklin's voice. It was protective. She sat. The past, however, would not stay buried as easily as the snow buried the trail. It came for her in the one place he couldn't guard, her sleep. She was back in the saloon. Macklin's breath was on her face, hot and sour with whiskey. His thick fingers were digging into her arm, pulling her toward the stairs. "It's time, little bird," he was saying, his voice a wet chuckle. "Time to sing for your supper." She was fighting, scratching, but he was too strong. He raised his hand, the ring glinting in the lamplight. Rosalie woke with a raw, gagging scream that tore the silence of the cabin to shreds. She was thrashing, tangled in the heavy robes, her hands clawing at the air, fighting an enemy who wasn't there. Seth was across the room in 2 strides. He had been sleeping on a pile of pelts by the door, his rifle beside him. He was a dark, powerful shape against the dying glow of the fire. "Hey, hey!" His voice was sharp, cutting through the panic. He didn't grab her. He put his big hands on her shoulders, holding her still, pinning her against the cot. "You're safe," he said, his voice low and fierce. "You're here, in the cabin. You're safe." His words, and the solid, unshakable weight of his hands, broke the dream. The image of Macklin shattered, and the reality of the small, warm cabin rushed in. The terror, finding no purchase in the present, collapsed. It broke her. The dam of control she had held onto for weeks, for years, finally gave way. A sob, a ragged, ugly sound, ripped itself from her throat. She lunged forward, her body acting of its own accord, and buried her face in his chest. She clung to the rough fabric of his shirt, her fists grabbing, her body shaking with the force of her weeping. She cried for her father, for her lost home, for the beating, for the fear, for the cold. She cried out all the poison and the shame. Seth went rigid. He was a fortress, and his walls had just been breached. He was not a man who touched. He was not a man who was touched. He froze, his hands hovering in the air, his whole body tense and awkward. She didn't stop. She just sobbed into his chest, a broken, wounded animal. Slowly, as if lifting a great weight, his arms came around her, one hand hesitant, settled on her shaking back. The other, even more slowly, came to rest on the back of her head, his fingers spreading wide through her clean hair. He held her. He didn't pat, he didn't shush her. He just held her, a solid wall, a shield against the storm inside her. He cradled her body, and he let her break. A long time passed. The fire crackled. The wind moaned outside. Finally, the sobs tapered off into hiccuping breaths. She was exhausted, limp against him. He eased her back down onto the cot, pulling the heavy buffalo robe up to her chin. Her eyes were swollen shut, her face damp, but the terror was gone. "Sleep," he murmured. The word was rough, like gravel. "No one's coming in here." She believed him. Her eyes fluttered, and she was asleep in moments, a deep, exhausted sleep. Not of terror, but of release. Seth went back to his pelts by the door, but he did not lie down. He sat, his back against the cold logs, and stared into the embers. His heart was hammering, a slow, painful beat he didn't recognize. He could still feel her, the fragile weight of her against his chest, the sharp bones of her shoulders under his hands, the silk of her hair against his skin. He had lived his life on pain, on anger, on the cold, clean emptiness of the mountains. It was simple. It was safe. This was not simple. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He felt the phantom warmth of her tears soaking his shirt. A feeling rose in him, something hot and fierce and protective, a feeling he had buried with his mother. He wanted her. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was not the base, ugly want of a man like Macklin. It was a deeper, more agonizing pull, a want to protect, to shield, to keep. It was a want that made him vulnerable. He squeezed his eyes shut. He was afraid. Not of the snow, not of the bounty hunters, not of the men in town. He was afraid of the small, sleeping woman on his cot, and the dangerous, terrifying hope she brought with her the night she broke. Something else broke with her. The silence. It was no longer the heavy, brittle quiet of two strangers trapped by a storm. It was a shared silence. Softer. Punctuated the next morning by the scrape of a spoon against a bowl. Rosalie sat at the table. His table, wrapped in a blanket. He'd given her one of his own flannel shirts, a thing so large it hung on her like a canvas sack, the sleeves rolled up 6 times. He poured hot, bitter tea into her cup. She had stopped crying, but her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. He sat opposite her, lacing his boots, his head down. He didn't know what to do with a woman's tears. He knew how to set a broken bone, track a deer in a whiteout, and kill. This was a different kind of wound, one he couldn't stitch. My father, she said, her voice small, rusty. Seth's hand stilled on the leather laces. He didn't look up. He just listened. He was a preacher, a good man. He came to Redemption Gap to save souls. She gave a small, bitter laugh that sounded more like a cough. He didn't understand men like Macklin. He thought words and faith were enough. She traced a knot in the wooden table with her finger. He died of lung fever 2 years ago. Left me with nothing but his debts. The church elders, Mr. Harris and the others, they said he owed money to the mining company, to Macklin. Seth tied the lace with a hard, final jerk. He knew Harris, a rat in a suit. They were kind, at first, she whispered. Said I could work off the debt. I did laundry for the saloon, mended clothes, cleaned. Her voice hitched. But the debt never got smaller. And Mr. Macklin, he has a particular favor. Seth stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping the floor. He went to the fireplace and gripped the mantel, his back to her, his knuckles white. They told me last week it was a blessing, that Mr. Macklin had agreed to forgive the debt in exchange for my hand, a marriage arrangement. They said it was my duty, to honor my father, to repay the town's kindness. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if she were reciting a grocery list. That was the most terrible part. He hit me the night before, because I I wasn't grateful enough. He said he'd teach me gratitude after the wedding, so I ran." She finished her story, and there was only the sound of the fire eating wood. Seth turned. His dark face was a mask, his eyes holding a cold, deep fury that wasn't for her. It was for the world that made such things possible. He still said nothing. He didn't offer comfort or pity. He didn't say, "It will be all right." He walked to the corner, picked up his heavy buffalo hide coat, and tossed it onto the cot. "Put this on, and your boots." "Where are we going?" she asked, a new fear rising. "Nowhere. You're learning." He grabbed a small skinning knife from his belt. "You're weak. You need meat. You'll learn to get it." He took her only as far as the tree line, where the wind wasn't so sharp. The snow was deep, but a hard crust had formed that mostly held their weight. He showed her a rabbit run, the small, beaten path in the snow. "They follow the path. They're stupid," he said, his voice clipped. He pulled a length of thin, pliable wire from his pocket. "You make a loop, so you tie it to this branch. You set it so the loop is here." He adjusted it, his gloved fingers precise. The rabbit runs. Its head goes in, the wire pulls tight. Simple. He made her do the next one. Her fingers, even in the thick mittens he'd given her, were clumsy and numb. She fumbled with the wire, her frustration mounting. "Not like that. You'll just feed the rabbits." He grabbed her hand, his touch rough, and repositioned her fingers on the wire. "Make the knot tight. Pull it. Harder." She pulled. It held. He nodded. A single, curt motion. Again, they set 5 snares. She was shaking with cold and exhaustion by the time they returned. But a small, hot spark of pride was lit. She had done something. The next day, he taught her how to patch. He gave her his own spare shirt, the one with a long tear in the shoulder. "Waste of good flannel," he grunted, tossing it in her lap, along with a needle and a spool of thick, black thread. She looked at the needle, then at him. "This is men's work?" "This is surviving work," he said, sitting at his table to re-oil his rifle. "Holes let in the cold. Cold kills. Don't matter if it's a man's hole or a woman's hole. So she sewed. Her stitches were neater than his, small and even. She'd mended for the saloon, but this felt different. This was mending for a purpose. She was mending for the man who had saved her. She found a strange satisfaction in the pull of the thread, in making the torn fabric whole again. He taught her to split firewood. He took her to the wood pile, a massive stack he'd built against the cabin wall. He handed her the axe. It was heavy, the handle worn smooth. "This ain't for you," she said, her arms straining to hold it. "It is if you want to be warm," he replied. He took it from her, set a round of lodgepole pine on the block. "Watch. You don't fight the wood. You read it." He pointed to a small crack in the grain. "It wants to split here. You put the blade here, let the weight of the axe do the work. Don't swing with your arms. Swing with your whole body. From your boots." He split the log in one clean, powerful motion. The 2 halves fell away, smelling of sharp pine. He stepped back. "Your turn." She tried. The axe head was too heavy. Her first swing missed the log entirely, burying itself in the snow. She heard him sigh, an impatient sound. She set her jaw. She was not weak. She would not be weak. She picked up the axe, hefted it again, centered herself. She swung. It bit into the wood, but didn't split it. Again. She swung again, and again, on the 5th try, fueled by a rising tide of stubbornness and shame. She put all her weight into it. The axe bit deep, and the wood cracked, splitting in 2. She stumbled back, breathing hard, her arms burning. She looked up at him, defiant. Seth stared at her, her small, thin frame, her face flushed with effort, her eyes flashing. A strange, almost imperceptible softening happened at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile. It was something less, and more. "Do it again," he said. By the end of the week, the cabin had a new rhythm. It was a rhythm for 2. She began to cook. taking the rabbits from his traps, the ones she had helped snare, and making a rich, thick stew. Adding the wild herbs she found in his tins, he showed her how to make bannock bread, a simple, dense flatbread cooked in the cast-iron skillet over the embers. He was a silent teacher, but a patient one. He showed. He didn't tell. He taught her how to bank the fire at night so it would still have coals in the morning. He taught her how to tell by the sound of the wind if a new storm was coming. She learned him, too. She learned he hated the taste of burnt coffee. She learned he slept lightly, waking at any new sound. She learned that the scar on his face pulled tight when he was angry, and that he had a deep, abiding loyalty to the animals he hunted, never wasting a single piece of the kill. One afternoon, she was scrubbing the stew pot at the table. He was repairing a snowshoe, his hands busy with wet, pliable leather. "You've never asked my name," she said, her back to him. He stopped his work. "Don't need to. It's Rosalie." He nodded. He didn't offer his own. He didn't need to. He was just Seth, the man who had found her. The air in the cabin grew smaller, thicker. They had grown comfortable, but it was the comfort of two wild things who have agreed not to bite. Now, a new feeling was creeping in, an awareness. It was in the way his eyes lingered on her hands as she kneaded the bread. It was in the way her breath hitched when he brushed past her in the narrow space between the cot and the fire, his arm grazing her shoulder. His smell, a mix of pine, wood smoke, and a clean, male scent, started to feel less like a threat and more like home. They ate their meals in silence, but the silence was no longer empty. It was charged. He would watch her as she ate, her head bent, the firelight catching the red highlights in her brown hair. She would watch him when she thought he wasn't looking, studying the hard line of his jaw, the way his long black hair fell over his shoulders when the leather thong came undone. One night, she laughed. He had been telling her, in his sparse, clipped way, about a bear that had stolen an entire side of bacon from his camp the summer before. He'd told it as a complaint, but the image of the massive, taciturn man yelling at a thieving bear struck her as funny. A small, light sound bubbled up from her chest. The sound shocked them both. Seth stopped talking, his head snapping up. Her laugh died, her hand flying to her mouth, as if to catch it. His expression was unreadable. Then, very slowly, he turned back to the fire, but she saw it. A faint, almost invisible, pull at the corner of his scarred mouth. The tension was a third person in the room. It was a living, breathing thing that sat between them, growing stronger every day. The thaw came, not with warmth, but with a wet, heavy snow. It was no longer the dry, stinging powder of the deep cold, but a clinging, soaking blanket that fell for 2 straight days. Rosalie had to go outside, to the small outhouse Seth had built 50 yards from the cabin. She returned, soaked, his heavy coat not enough to stop the wet from seeping through. She was shivering, her teeth chattering, snow clinging to her hair and melting down her neck. "Change," he ordered, not looking up from the trap he was mending. "You'll catch your death." He'd strung a length of rope and hung a heavy, moth-eaten blanket to give her a corner of privacy by the cot. It was a gesture that had, in the beginning, made her feel safer. Now, it just felt thin. She went behind it, her fingers clumsy and numb. She stripped off the damp flannel shirt, her skin prickling in the warm, dry air of the cabin. She stood for a moment in just her thin chemise, her back to the room. She reached for the dry shirt, but her foot slipped on the small puddle of melted snow from her boots. She stumbled, grabbing for balance. Her hand caught the blanket, pulling it sideways. The rope sagged, and the blanket slid, exposing her. She froze. Seth, alerted by the sound, had turned his head. It was only a second, a fraction of time, but he saw it all. Her back. It was not the smooth, pale skin of a young woman. It was a canvas of old, silvery white welts, ropes of scar tissue that twisted from her shoulders down to her waist. A history of cruelty, written on her skin. Rosalie gasped, pulling the blanket closed, her face burning with a shame so hot it burned her eyes. She waited for the disgust, the pity, the turning away. She heard a sound, not a word, a low, guttural noise, like an animal. She peeked through the gap in the blanket. He was on his feet. He was not looking at her. He was staring at the wall, at his rifle hanging on the pegs. His hands were clenched at his sides, the knuckles white, the muscles in his forearms standing out like coiled rope. There was no judgment in his eyes. There was no pity. There was a rage so profound, so cold and so black. It was terrifying. It was the rage of a man who understood, too well, what it meant to be marked by others. He turned, his movement stiff, and walked to the cabin door. He braced his hand against the thick log frame. His head bowed. He punched the wood. It was not a wild, drunken swing. It was a single, controlled explosion of violence. The entire cabin shuddered with the impact. He stood there for a long time, his back to her, his shoulders heaving. Then, without a word, he grabbed his coat, pulled the door open, and walked out into the falling snow. He was gone for hours. When he returned, he was caked in ice, and he was carrying a fresh deer slung over his shoulders. He didn't speak a word about what he'd seen. He just set about skinning the animal, his movements precise and brutal. That night, the air in the cabin was unbreathable. The unspoken thing between them had a name now. It had a shape, and it was hungry. Rosalie couldn't sleep. She lay on the cot, staring into the darkness. The image of his face, of that terrible, protective anger, burned into her mind. He had not been disgusted. He had been angry, for her. He was by the fire, sitting on his chair, not on his usual pelts. He was sharpening his knife. Shing, shing, shing. The sound was slow, rhythmic, and it was grating on her last nerve. She sat up. The buffalo robe fell to her waist. Seth! The shing stopped. He didn't turn. What? She got out of the cot, her bare feet cold on the wood floor. She walked to the fire, standing in front of him, blocking the light. He was forced to look up. Why? She whispered. His eyes were dark, guarded. Why what? Why won't you look at me? Not since you saw... She swallowed, her voice trembling. Why won't you touch me? He stared at her, his face a hard, unreadable mask in the flickering light. The knife was still in his hand, the firelight gleaming off the polished blade. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind. He let out a long breath. A plume of white smoke in the cold cabin. He set the knife and the stone on the floor. Because, he said, and his voice was a low, hoarse rasp. I wanted too much. The words hit her like a physical blow, not of rejection, of confession, of a desire so great it had to be caged, just like his anger. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of himself. She looked at him, truly looked at him. The scar, the dark eyes, the hard mouth. He was not a monster. He was a man who had shown her nothing but a hard, gruff, and profound kindness. A man who had seen the worst of her, the ugliest parts, and had not flinched. Her own fear, the fear of Macklin, the fear of men, the fear of being worthless property. It all just dissolved. Her hands were shaking. She stepped closer, into the space between his knees. Rosalie, he said. It was a warning, a plea. She didn't listen. She put her hands on his shoulders. The flannel of his shirt was coarse under her palms, and the muscle beneath was rock solid. He was trembling, or maybe she was. She leaned in, slow, giving him every chance to pull away, to stop her. He just watched her, his eyes wide, like a wolf caught in a trap it didn't understand. She pressed her lips to his. It was not a practiced kiss. It was hesitant, soft, and chaste. It was just her mouth, pressing against his. But it was a choice, her first choice. It was tender, and it was terrified, and it was a question. For a second, he was utterly still. Then, with a groan that seemed ripped from his very soul, his hand came up, fast, his fingers tangling in her hair. His other hand gripped her waist, pulling her hard against him. He didn't kiss her back. He just held her, his mouth frozen against hers. Then, just as quickly. He pulled away. He pushed her back, not roughly, but with a finality that broke the contact. "Don't," he said, his voice raw, his eyes squeezed shut. "Don't!" She looked at him, her heart hammering, her lips tingling. She was not afraid. She was not ashamed. She touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his scar. He flinched, but didn't pull away. "You're the first man," she whispered, her voice shaking but clear, "that I've ever wanted to want me." The confession hung in the small cabin, more powerful than any storm. It stilled him. He opened his eyes, and the fury, the desire, and the fear were all there, warring for control. She shivered, the cold of the cabin floor seeping into her feet. "Go to bed," he said. The gravel was gone. His voice was raw. "I'm cold," she whispered. It was the truth. He looked at the cot, then at his own pile of pelts by the door. He seemed to be fighting a battle with himself. He scrubbed a hand over his face. He stood, went to the cot, and smoothed the blankets. Then he grabbed his heaviest furs and threw them onto the cot, on the side near the wall. He nodded at it. She understood. She climbed in, pulling the robes up, her heart a wild bird in her chest. She lay on her side, facing the fire. He hesitated. Then he took off his boots and his gun belt. He lay down on the cot, on top of his furs, his back to her. He was a rigid, unmoving line of muscle. They were side by side, inches apart, not touching. The air was electric. It was thick with unspoken words, with the raw, undeniable hunger of two lonely souls who had just, for the first time, seen each other. Sleep was a long, long way off. That night, they slept with a blade's edge of space between them, two bodies rigid, radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. The air was so charged, a single spark felt like it could ignite the room. Neither slept. They listened to the wind, and they listened to each other breathe. By morning, the wind was no longer a moan. It was a solid, high-pitched scream. The world outside the greased paper window was gone, replaced by a churning, solid wall of white. The blizzard that had been threatening for days had finally struck, not as a storm, but as a war. Seth was on his feet before the first gray light, his face grim. He checked the door, pushing his shoulder against it. It held, but the sound of the wind was a physical force, rattling the latch. "Stay away from the window," he grunted, already stuffing dried grass into the cracks around the door frame. "Wind finds a crack, it'll tear the glass, and stay by the fire. We're in for it." The first day, they were restless. They still kept to their routines. He checked his pelts. She cooked the bannock, but the space was too small. Every time they passed, their bodies brushed. Every time. A jolt, sharp as static, passed between them. The second day, the cabin grew dark. The snow was piling up, covering the window, casting the room in a permanent, gloomy twilight. The cold was a living thing, seeping through the logs. They had to keep the fire roaring, feeding it precious wood. Seth's face was tight with a new anxiety. Not for himself, but for the wood pile. "I gotta get more wood," he said on the morning of the third day. The wind had dropped, but the snow was still falling, thick and heavy. "You can't," she said, her voice sharp. "You'll be lost in 5 steps. We get cold. We die. We got no choice." He pulled on his heavy coat, wrapped his face in a scarf, and grabbed the axe. He tied a length of rope from the door latch to his own waist. "Don't open this door for nothing. I'll knock 3 times. You hear anything else, you feed the fire." He went out. Rosalie was left alone in the dim, roaring silence of the cabin. She paced, her heart a cold knot of dread. It was no longer about Macklin, or the town. It was about this man, this cabin. The world had shrunk to this one small, warm room, and the man who kept it safe. It was almost an hour. She was starting to believe he was gone, swallowed by the white, when the 3 heavy thumps shook the door. She fumbled with the bar, pulling it back. He fell inside in a cloud of snow and freezing air, his arms full of wood. He was covered in it, his eyebrows and hair stark white, his face raw and red from the wind. He dropped the wood by the hearth and uncoiled the rope from his waist, his hands stiff. "It's bad," he said, his voice muffled as he unwrapped his face. "Drifts are higher than the roof on the north side. I could barely find the wood pile." She was standing there, shaking, her hands clasped. He looked at her, and the hard line of his jaw softened. He had seen fear in her before, fear of him, fear of her past. This was different. This was fear for him. The storm locked them in. For 2 more days. They existed in the twilight. The cabin became their entire world. They ate, they fed the fire, they slept, and they watched each other. The pretense was gone. There was no work to be done, no traps to check, nothing to distract them from the simple, undeniable fact that they were a man and a woman, alone. On the 5th day, the snowfall stopped, the wind died, and a heavy, oppressive silence fell. "Got to clear the roof," Seth said, his voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "Wait'll bring it in." He climbed onto the table, pushed open the smoke hatch in the ceiling, and hauled himself up. Rosalie watched him go, a knot in her stomach. He was up there for a long time, the scrape of his shovel a comfort. She went outside, just to the lee of the cabin, to draw a bucket of clean snow for melting. The world was blinding. The snow was a smooth, white ocean, swallowing every landmark. It was beautiful, and it was deadly. She was scooping snow when she heard the slide, a great, groaning whoosh. She looked up. A massive drift from the roof, loosened by his shovel, was coming down, an avalanche in miniature. She screamed, tried to run, but her foot, in the mended boots, caught on a hidden piece of firewood. She fell backward, landing hard in a deep drift. The breath knocked from her. Before she could even process what happened, he was there. He had dropped from the roof like a cat, plunging through the waist-deep snow, his face a mask of terror. He reached her in 3 strides, hauling her up by the arms. "Rosalie, are you hurt? Did it hit you?" "No, I slipped," she gasped, her hands clinging to his coat, her lungs burning. He was holding her, his hands like vices on her upper arms, his dark eyes searching her face, wild and desperate. He had thought the snow had buried her. He had thought he had lost her. "I'm fine," she breathed. "I'm fine. Seth." He saw she was, and the terror in his eyes was replaced by something else, something hotter and just as wild. The control he had maintained for weeks, the iron wall he had built around his want. It shattered. He didn't say a word. He just hauled her against him. His mouth came down on hers, not gently, not tenderly, but with a raw, possessive hunger that stole the breath from her lungs. It was not a kiss of affection. It was a kiss of desperation, of a man starved. His lips were hard, demanding, tasting of the cold air and a deep, buried anger. He was claiming her, marking her, erasing the phantom touch of every man who had ever looked at her. One of his hands tangled in her hair, pulling her head back, while the other arm banded around her waist like steel, lifting her against him, crushing her to his chest. Rosalie's world tilted. This was not the chaste, questioning kiss she had given him. This was a force of nature, as untamed as the blizzard that had trapped them. It was terrifying, and it was exactly what she wanted. She didn't fight. She didn't pull away. She met his hunger with her own, her hands gripping his shoulders, her body molding to his. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathing hard, their breath pluming in the frigid air. He stared down at her, his chest heaving. He looked like a man who had just run a mile. He scooped her up, one arm under her knees, the other around her back, as if she weighed nothing. He kicked the cabin door open, it had swung shut behind her, and carried her inside. Kicking it closed again. He didn't put her down. He carried her straight to the cot, the world a blur of fur and firelight. He laid her down on the buffalo robes, his body following, caging her in. One hand braced on either side of her head. He was huge, a shadow blotting out the light, his eyes burning. The raw desire from outside was still on him, but now it was mixed with a dawning horror. He was seeing her, seeing the fear that was creeping back into her eyes. He was doing exactly what he had sworn he would not. He was frightening her. Rosalie looked up at him. The man who had been so careful, so distant, was gone. This man was a stranger, his body taut with a need that felt overwhelming, vast. He was so big. She thought of Macklin, of the force, the pain. Her body tensed, her hands coming up to his chest, not to pull him closer, but to push him away. "Seth," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, I don't, it's too big, I'll break." The words were a bucket of ice water. He stopped. He didn't just stop moving. His entire body went still. The raw, animal hunger in his eyes vanished, replaced by a profound, aching pain. He had broken her, not her body, but her trust. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse, guttural. He pulled back, rolling off her, sitting on the edge of the cot, his back to her. He put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "No, gods, I'm sorry. I wouldn't." She lay there, her heart hammering. She watched his broad, strong back, the back that had held her as she wept, now bent in shame. He wasn't like Macklin. He wasn't angry at her for her fear. He was angry at himself. Slowly, she sat up. She touched his back. He flinched, but didn't pull away. "Seth," she said, her voice stronger now. He turned his head, his face a ruin of self-loathing. She moved, shifting on the cot until she was kneeling in front of him. She took his face in her hands. His skin was rough, his beard scraping her palms. "I didn't mean, I am not afraid of you," she said, her voice clear. "I am afraid of this. I don't know how. I only know how to be hurt." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. He saw the truth. He saw her fear, but he also saw the resolve, the want. He took a long, shuddering breath, his hands coming up to cover hers, pressing her palms against his cheeks. "You won't break," he whispered. He moved his hands, slowly, reverently, from her face, down her neck, to her waist, settling on the flare of her hips. He held her, his grip firm, grounding. "You will take it all. I've got you." It was a promise, a vow. He leaned in and kissed her. This kiss was not the blizzard. This was the fire. It was slow and deep and full of questions. His lips were soft, moving over hers with an aching tenderness. He was asking, she was answering. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. "Rosalie," he breathed, as if her name was a prayer. He moved slowly. There was no rush. The storm was over, and the world was quiet. He undid the buttons of her shirt, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He paused at every one, his eyes holding hers, giving her every chance to stop him. She did not. She arched her back, helping him, her own hands fumbling with the buttons of his shirt. When the last button was undone, he pulled the fabric open. He didn't look at her body. He looked at her back. He turned her, his touch light on her shoulders, and he looked at the scars that mapped her skin. He didn't touch them with anger. Not this time. He touched them with reverence. He traced the largest welt, from her shoulder to her waist, with one long, slow stroke of his finger. And then he lowered his head, and he pressed his lips to it. A sob broke from her. He had not kissed her mouth. He had kissed her shame. He turned her back, his eyes wet. He kissed the hollow of her throat. He kissed the pulse at her wrist. He kissed the palm of her hand. He worshipped her. He laid her down on the furs, and he showed her, with his hands and his mouth and his body, what it meant to be seen. He was slow. He was careful. He was powerful. But his power was all for her. He taught her the shape of her own body, the places that could feel not pain, but a pleasure so sharp it bordered on it. When he finally came inside her, it was a slow, perfect joining. She gasped, her eyes wide, but it was not pain. It was fullness. It was him. He held her hips. "I've got you," he whispered again, and he began to move. He made love to her. He didn't take. He didn't claim. He joined her. When it was over, she wept. She lay curled in his arms, her face buried in his chest, and she cried, not with the ragged, ugly sobs of her nightmare, but with quiet, cleansing tears. He held her, stroking her hair, his own heart too full for words. "It didn't hurt," she whispered, her voice thick. "It's not meant to," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. She pulled back, just enough to look at him. "No," she said. "It wasn't that. It was, I felt, you saw me, all of me, and you didn't turn away." He pulled her closer, his arms a fortress. "Never," he vowed. In the days that followed, the cabin was transformed. The blizzard had passed, leaving them in a world of brilliant white and impossible quiet. But the true change was inside. They were no longer two strangers. They were a man and a woman. They were lovers. The tension was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-warm comfort. They slept curled together, her back pressed to his front, his arms slung possessively over her waist, her feet tangled with his. He no longer slept by the door. His place was with her. She woke one morning to find him watching her, his head propped on his hand. "Your beard scratches," she murmured, her voice sleepy. A slow smile, the first she had ever seen, touched his lips. "Does it now?" Later that day, she saw him stropping his razor on a strip of leather. He was heating water in the pot. "Let me," she said. He turned, the razor in his hand. "This is no toy. Rosalie." "I know." She took the bowl, mixed the soap into a lather with a small bristle brush. "My father, I used to do this for him. When his hands shook, at the end..." He sat in the chair, his face unreadable. He handed her the razor. She lathered his face, her hands gentle. He had to tilt his head back, exposing the long, strong line of his throat. She held his life in her hand. The trust was absolute. She shaved him with slow, careful strokes. He didn't move. He just watched her, his dark eyes following her every move. When she was done, she wiped his face with a damp, warm cloth. His skin was smooth beneath her fingers. He caught her hand, turned it over, and kissed her palm. The next day, it was his turn. Her hair was greasy, lank. He pointed to the large tub. "Sit!" He heated bucket after bucket of snow, pouring it into the tub until it was steaming. He tested the water with his elbow. He made her sit on a low stool. He poured a small amount of the lye soap into his hands and, standing behind her, began to wash her hair. His fingers were strong, massaging her scalp, working the soap into a lather. It was a luxury she hadn't known in years. He was as methodical as he was when cleaning his rifle, but his touch was infinitely tender. He rinsed it with clean, warm water, pouring it from a cup until it squeaked. He wrapped her head in a dry cloth and sat her by the fire. "You'll catch your death," he said, the old, gruff words, now a code for "I care about you." He sat behind her and combed it, just as he had before. But this time, when it was dry, he didn't stop. He gathered the long, brown mass in his hands, and, his fingers surprisingly deft, he braided it, one long, thick braid. He finished, and his hands rested on her shoulders. She leaned back against his legs. They sat like that for a long time, just watching the fire. That night, she asked him, "Your scar, how?" He was lying on his back, her head on his chest. His hand, which was stroking her hair, stilled. "My father," he said, his voice flat. "The land dispute?" He nodded. "He was a white man, an outlaw. But he staked a claim. Other men wanted it. They said he was a squaw man. That his claim wasn't legal because he was with my mother. They came, he fought. I was maybe 8. He was teaching me to shoot." He was silent for so long. She thought he wouldn't continue. "One of them, he had me, put his knife to my face. Told my father to drop the rifle. My father did. They shot him, the man with the knife. He smiled. He just cut me, to mark me. So you remember what a breed's life is worth." Rosalie's hand tightened on his chest. "My mother," he went on, his voice a dead monotone. She fought. She was Cheyenne, a warrior. But there were too many. They didn't kill her. They said she was valuable. Soldiers came, took her, said she was being relocated to a reservation. I never saw her again. He looked up at the ceiling, his eyes seeing a past she could only imagine. I ran, lived in the mountains. I'm not white. I'm not Cheyenne. I don't belong anywhere. You belong here, she whispered, her voice fierce. She raised her head and kissed the scar, right on his eyebrow. You belong with me. He held her so tightly, she could barely breathe. She told him her own story, not the facts of it. He knew those. She told him the feel of it. I never knew what love meant, she said, her voice muffled against his skin. For me, it was just obedience. Father said, we love God by obeying him. The town elders said, show your love for your father's memory by obeying us. Macklin, he said he would teach me to love him. It was always a word for a cage. For fear, for shame. She pulled back, looking him in the eye. The firelight danced in hers. Until what you've given me, this isn't a cage. It's the first time I've ever been free. Their love bloomed in the quiet of the snow. It was a fierce, desperate, and tender thing, born in a bubble of white. They made love, they talked, they laughed. They built a life in one room, but outside, the world was waiting. The sun began to shine, the bright, high country sun, with a new warmth to it. The snow, which had been their fortress, began to melt. Icicles formed, and then dripped. They could hear the sound of running water under the drifts. The thaw was coming, and with the thaw, the trails would open. They stood at the door one evening, watching the sky turn a brilliant, cold purple. The air was warmer. Rosalie shivered, and it wasn't from the cold. She leaned into Seth's side, and he wrapped his arm around her. He'll come, won't he? She whispered. Seth didn't answer. He just stared down at the valley, at the world that was beginning to reappear from under the snow. His jaw was set. His hand went to the knife on his belt. The thaw was coming, and with it, danger. Spring did not arrive gently in the high country. It came with the sound of violence. The snow, which had been their white, silent fortress, began to rot from within. The world turned to a gray slush. Avalanches rumbled in the distance, a sound like cannons. The creeks, frozen for months, became choked, angry rivers of ice melt and mud. Inside the cabin, their peace held, but it was a fragile thing. The bubble they had lived in was thinning. They both knew it. Seth grew restless, his eyes constantly scanning the lower valley, which was now visible as a dark, wet smear of pine and earth. Rosalie's cough started as a small tickle, a minor complaint, but the damp, heavy air of the thaw settled in her chest. Within a week, it was a deep, racking bark that left her weak and pale. Seth watched her, his face a mask of granite. He brewed her the last of his mother's bitter herbs, but they did little. The fever came one night, her skin hot and dry, her breathing shallow. He knew what he had to do. He had known this day was coming. We're going to town, he said one morning, his voice final. Rosalie, huddled by the fire, looked up at him, her eyes wide with a feverish terror. No, Seth, we can't. They'll. You're sick, he said, cutting her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. He was strapping his gun belt on. You need laudanum for the cough and quinine for the fever. We're out of flour. We're out of salt. We can't stay here forever. But they'll see me, she whispered, her voice cracking. You'll wear my hat. Keep your head down, he said. He was already loading his rifle, checking the mechanism. His movements were too sharp, too angry. He was furious. Not at her, but at the world, at the necessity of it. I'll not have you die on me, Rosalie, not from this. He saddled the mule, the only animal he kept, a stubborn creature named Silas. He wouldn't risk her on the treacherous trails on foot. He wrapped her in his heaviest furs, sat her on the mule, and then, taking the lead rope, They began the long, slow descent. It took them half a day to reach the valley floor. The trail was a river of mud, and the air grew thicker, warmer as they descended. Redemption Gap was not a town, so much as a wound in the earth. It was a single, muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings. 2 saloons, a general store, a closed-down church, and the ever-present, sour smell of stale beer and desperation. As they approached, Seth pulled the brim of his hat low on her head. It was huge, swallowing her, the shadow covering her face completely. "Stay on the mule," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Don't look at no one. Don't speak." He tied the mule to the hitching post in front of Miller's general store. The street was quiet. It was mid-morning, too early for the drunks, too late for the prospectors. But there were eyes. Rosalie felt them immediately. Mrs. Miller herself, sweeping the boardwalk, her eyes narrowing as she saw the half-breed, McCrae, and the small, huddled figure on his mule. A curtain twitched in the window of the land office. Seth put a hand on Rosalie's knee, a brief, hard squeeze. "I'll be quick." He went inside the store. Rosalie sat, her head bowed, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. She focused on Seth's handprint, the fading warmth on her leg. The door of the saloon, Macklin's saloon, creaked open. A man stepped out, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the mud. He squinted at her. Rosalie's blood went cold. It was Jed, one of Macklin's men, a mean, lanky man with dead eyes. He sauntered over, his spurs ringing on the boardwalk. "Well now," he said, his voice a low drawl. "What's this, McCrae? You finally buy yourself a woman, or just rentin' one?" Rosalie didn't move. She didn't breathe. Jed stepped off the boardwalk, his boots sinking into the mud. He was close now, close enough for her to smell the whiskey on his breath. "What's the matter, girl? Too good to say hello?" He reached up, his grimy hand grabbing the brim of the hat. "Let's see what he paid for." He ripped the hat from her head. The pale, thin light of the valley hit her face. Her hair, braided by Seth, tumbled down. Jed froze. His hand was still in the air. His jaw went slack. "I'll be," he whispered. "I'll be damned. It's the preacher's girl." Rosalie's scream was a thin, high sound. At the same moment, the door of the general store burst open. Seth was a blur. He had the sack of supplies in one hand. He dropped it. He didn't say a word. He cleared the 5 feet between the boardwalk and Jed in one animal-like bound. His left hand shot out, grabbing the front of Jed's shirt. Twisting, his right hand, a fist like a granite boulder, connected with Jed's jaw. The sound was a wet, heavy crack, like an axe splitting green wood. Jed went down. He didn't just fall. He was driven into the mud, unconscious before he landed. The street, which had been quiet, was suddenly electric. Doors opened. Faces appeared. "It's her! It's Rosalie Thorne! Mrs.!" Miller shrieked, pointing. Seth ignored them. He grabbed the sack of flour, his face a black mask of rage. He didn't look at Rosalie. He looked past her, at the wall of the sheriff's office, and she saw what he was looking at, nailed to the wood. Fresh and white was a poster. Her stomach dropped. She didn't need to read the words. She saw her name. She saw the number. "Reward," it said in thick black letters. $100. Seth ripped the poster from the wall. He read it aloud, his voice shaking with a fury so cold it burned the air. "Stolen property. 1 Rosalie Thorne, indentured servant, fled the lawful protection of her benefactor, Mr. Alistair Macklin. $100 for her return, $50 for information leading to her capture, dead or alive." "Stolen property," Rosalie whispered, the words like ash in her mouth. She was going to be sick. "Seth," she pleaded. "Seth, let's go." Whispers were erupting all around them. "That's her. With the half-breed? $100. Macklin's been mad as a hornet. Get on the mule." Seth snarled. He had ripped the poster, but he shoved the pieces into his coat. He threw the sack over the mule's back, grabbed the lead rope, and pulled. He didn't walk, He ran. He pulled the mule at a bone-jarring trot out of the town, not back up the high trail, but east, toward the river, into the thick pine. They didn't stop until they were miles away, hidden in a deep cleft of rock, the sound of the rushing water covering their tracks. He pulled her from the mule. She was shaking so hard she collapsed against him. He called me property. She sobbed into his chest. Dead or alive? You're not, he said, his voice a raw sound. He was holding her so tightly. His arms were shaking. You're not. You're mine. He pulled back, his dark eyes burning into hers. You're mine, and he ain't never gettin' his hands on you. He hadn't meant to say it. He had never thought of her as his, not as property, not as a thing to be owned. He meant it as a vow. He was her shield. He was her man, and the world had just declared war on them. They made it back to the cabin by nightfall, using a winding, treacherous animal trail Seth knew. The peace was gone. The cabin, which had been their fortress, their world, now felt like a trap. He'll come, Rosalie said, pacing the small floor. She had stopped crying. Her fear had been burned away, leaving a cold, hard dread. He'll send men that bounty, $100. Men will kill their own mothers for that. Let them come, Seth said, his voice grim. He was loading his rifle. He had two, the repeater, his main rifle, and an old, heavy-calibered buffalo gun. He laid them both on the table, along with his revolver and a box of cartridges. No, Seth, she cried, grabbing his arm. You don't understand. Macklin, he's not just a saloon owner. He's a monster. He'll kill you. You have to leave. Take me back, or just let me go. Leave me. Seth, go north. Go where they can't find you. This isn't your fight. He stopped what he was doing. He turned, slowly, and took her by the shoulders. His grip was gentle. I ran from my father's murderers, he said, his voice quiet, intense. I ran from the soldiers who took my mother. I've been running my whole life. Rosalie, I'm done running. But you'll die, she wept, her fists pounding uselessly on his chest. Maybe. He caught her hands, stilling them. He held them against his heart. But I ain't losing you. That was the end of the argument. The next night, the dog started barking. Seth didn't have a dog. He was on his feet in a second, his rifle in his hand. Rosalie's heart stopped. They had been sleeping, curled together, but it was a light, fitful sleep. Stay down, he whispered, pushing her off the cot, onto the floor, behind the table. He moved to the door, his body a shadow against the dim light of the embers. A voice called out, Hello, the cabin. Got a traveler here, cold and lost, just looking for a fire. It was a friendly voice, a folksy, easy voice. It was the most terrifying sound Rosalie had ever heard. Seth didn't answer. He stood, silent as the stone hearth, his rifle leveled at the door. Come on, friend, the voice called again. I can smell your smoke. I mean no harm, just froze. My horse went lame. Go. Seth's voice was a low, clear rumble. Or I'll shoot. There was a silence. The wind rustled the pines. Then a dry chuckle. Well now, that ain't friendly, but I reckon you got a right to be jumpy. A shadow moved past the greased paper window. Seeing as you're holed up with $100 of stolen property? Rosalie's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. She's a pretty little thing, the voice mused. Closer to the window now. Macklin wants her back. He don't much care in what condition, but I'd rather take the $100 than the $50. So I'll just be taking her. You can make this easy. Breed, or you can make it hard. Seth was silent. He aimed. The shot came from the back. A bullet splintered the door frame, just inches from Seth's head. A second gunman. Seth dove, rolling across the floor, coming up in the dark corner by the hearth. He fired the rifle. A deafening blast of thunder and fire that lit the room, blowing a hole in the door where the man's voice had been. A scream. He shot me! The bastard shot me! The shadow at the window fired, the bullet thudding into the log wall. "You're a dead man, McCrae," the man at the door yelled, his voice tight with pain. "Macklin's on his way. He'll burn you out." Seth didn't answer. He held up 2 fingers to Rosalie in the dark. 2 men. He was breathing hard, a small, dark smile on his face. This, he understood. This was a language he spoke. He crept to the window. The man was moving, trying to get a better angle. Seth was patient. He waited. A shadow moved. He fired. A gurgle. A heavy, wet fall. The cabin went silent. "Elias?" the man at the door whispered. "Elias, you son of a bitch! Breed! You killed him!" A volley of shots tore through the door. Blind, angry shots. Rosalie cowered, her eyes squeezed shut. Then, the sound of a horse. Riding away. Hard. The man was retreating. Seth waited for a full 5 minutes. The silence was absolute. He crept to the door, slid the bar back, and kicked it open, his rifle at his shoulder. Nothing. Just the cold, clean air, and the smell of gunpowder. He stepped out. Rosalie scrambled after him. The first man, the talker, was slumped against a tree, a dark stain spreading on his chest. He was dying. Seth walked over, his face grim. He kicked the man's pistol away. The man looked up, his eyes cloudy, a bloody froth on his lips. You're dead." He coughed. "Macklin, he's paid. He's coming. Him and the Cogan brothers. They'll skin you." He laughed. A horrible, wet sound. "And they'll take turns before they kill her." Seth pointed the rifle at the man's head. "Seth, no!" Rosalie screamed. Seth looked at her, then back at the dying man. He lowered the rifle. "Let him freeze." He turned and walked back into the cabin. He dragged the second body, the one he'd shot through the window, away from the cabin and into the trees. The blood on the snow was a black stain under the moonlight. They barred the door. The cabin was a wreck. Splinters everywhere, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Rosalie was shaking so hard she couldn't stand. She slid to the floor, her back against the wall. "He's coming," she whispered. "The Cogan brothers. They're animals. They're killers. They killed a whole family down in the Panhandle, just for their chickens." Seth sat at the table and began, methodically, to reload his rifle. "Seth, listen to me." She crawled over to him, her voice desperate. "He's coming. We have to run, now. We can go north, to the high passes. We can lose them." "He'll track us," Seth said, his voice flat. "And he'll find us. And we'll be in the open, with no food and no cover. This is our only chance. This cabin. This is good ground. Good ground to be buried in," she shrieked. "Maybe," he said. He slotted a cartridge into the chamber. "But it's our ground." He looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers. The fear was gone. The anger was gone. All that was left was a cold, hard resolve. "He called you property. He put a price on your head. He sent men to kill me. And to take you. This don't end. Rosalie, it don't end by running. It ends when he's in the ground." He stood up. He walked to the old chest where he kept his mother's few belongings, and he pulled out a revolver. It was smaller than his, but well-oiled. He pressed it into her hand. "You're gonna learn to shoot. I can't," she stammered, the metal cold and heavy. "You can't. You will. You're not the girl he beat. Rosalie, you're not the girl who ran. You're the woman who survived the blizzard. You're the woman who lives here. With me." He took her outside. The dead bounty hunter was still moaning, a faint, animal sound. Seth ignored him. He set a pine cone on a stump. "Hold it with 2 hands," he said, his voice all business. "Don't aim with your eye. Aim with your whole body. Point at it. Squeeze. Don't pull." Her hands shook. The first shot went wide, kicking up dirt. Again, the second shot was closer. Again, she shot and shot, until the gun was empty. By the last shot, her hands were steady. She hit the stump. "Good," he said. "Now we prepare." They worked all day. They boarded up the window, leaving only a small slit to shoot through. They stacked the wood pile against the weaker north wall. They brought buckets of snow inside, melting them, filling every pot with water. The cabin was no longer a home, it was a fort. That afternoon, Rosalie saw him shivering. His shirt, the one he'd worn in the fight, was torn and stained with the bounty hunter's blood. "Take it off," she said. He looked at her. "Take it off, Seth. It's a rag. You'll catch your death." He did. His upper body was a map of old scars, a mirror to her own. She took a clean cloth and water and, wordlessly, began to wash the blood from his skin. Her touch was not a lover's touch. It was a wife's. She went to her small bundle, the one she'd had when she fled. She pulled out the only other dress she had, a plain wool thing. She took Seth's knife and, without hesitation, began cutting it into strips. She sat by the fire, her needle and thread flashing. She was mending his other shirt, the one she had fixed before, but it was beyond repair. So, she sewed him a new one. She took the good fabric from her dress and patched the canvas of his. It was a strange, mismatched thing of brown canvas and gray wool, but it was warm, and it was whole. He sat, watching her, his bare shoulders wrapped in a blanket. She finished, the stitches small and tight, just as he'd taught her. She held it up. He didn't take it. He just looked at her, his face full of an emotion she couldn't name. "You're the only thing," he said, his voice rough, "that's ever felt like home." She put the shirt down and went to him. She didn't kiss him. She just put her arms around him, her face against his bare chest, and held on. As evening fell, the cabin was ready. The air was thick with a new, desperate tension. The fight was coming. Death was coming. "Rosalie," he said, his voice low, If I fall, you take the mule. You ride north. Don't stop. Don't look back." "Stop," she said, her voice fierce. "You won't fall." "If I do," he insisted, his grip tight on her arms. "You run. Swear it." I swear." The light was fading. The shadows in the cabin grew long. This could be their last night. He looked at her. The fear, the desperation, the love, it all boiled over. He pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers, not with the angry passion of the snow, but with a desperate, aching need. It was a kiss that said goodbye. It was a kiss that said forever. He lifted her, carried her to the cot, to their bed of furs. They made love with their clothes still on. A frantic, urgent collision. It was not about pleasure. It was about life. It was a desperate animal affirmation of living. A clawing, biting, clinging to each other in the face of the dark. Their bodies collided in the gloom. A desperate, silent promise. You are alive. I am alive. We are here. When it was over, they lay tangled, their hearts hammering in unison. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. They dressed. They took their positions. He, by the new slit in the boarded window. She, by the door, her revolver on the table. They waited. The hours ticked by. The fire burned down to red. Glowing eyes, the cabin was cold. And then, as the first, sick, gray light of dawn began to creep over the mountains, they heard it, the sound of horses. Not one, not two, many. Riders on the trail. The sound was a dull, wet, plodding. Horses, not running, but walking, conserving energy, sure of their arrival. Seth was already at his loophole, rifle resting on the sill. But he wasn't looking at the riders. He was looking at the rocks above them, the trees, checking for a glint of metal, a sign of snipers. They came into the clearing slowly, 3 of them. The man in front was Alistair Macklin. Rosalie, peering through a crack in the chinking, felt the air leave her lungs. He was just as she remembered, broad, soft, and dressed in a fine black wool coat. Despite the mud, he sat his horse like a sack of grain, but his face, pale and fleshy, held an expression of pure, satisfied malice. On his left was a man so thin he looked like a skeleton wrapped in hide, with a long, drooping mustache. On his right, a bull of a man, bearded to the eyes, with a heavy buffalo gun resting across his saddle. The Cogan brothers. They stopped 20 yards from the door, just out of easy pistol range. Macklin smiled, a wet, unpleasant stretching of his lips. He took off his hat, a fine beaver felt, and held it over his heart, as if in prayer. "Miss Thorne," he called, his voice booming, falsely pleasant. "Your benefactor is here. An honest misunderstanding, that's all. You've had your little adventure. It's time to come home." Rosalie pressed her back against the logs, her revolver heavy in her hand, her knuckles white. Seth's voice was a low, flat rumble. "She ain't going." Macklin's smile tightened. He put his hat back on. "Ah, the breed. Seth McCrae. I should have known. You always were a problem. Living up here, thinking the world below didn't apply to you? Well, it does." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. He tossed it into the mud. Halfway between them, it landed with a soft, heavy thud. "There's $100 in coin in that bag. McCrae. Gold. More than that bounty. Consider it. A finder's fee. You're a smart man. You know what she is. She's property. My property. You can't own her, but you can be paid for returning her. Take the gold. Ride north. Forget you ever saw her." "I'm a generous man." Rosalie looked at Seth. He hadn't moved. He was as still as the mountain. "She ain't property," Seth said. The words were quiet, but they carried. "And that ain't your money," the bull-necked Cogan brother. Amos spat. "Talkin's done. Macklin, let's just burn him out." Macklin held up a plump, gloved hand. "Patience. Amos. Mr. McCrae is considering his options. $100. Breed. Or, you keep the girl, and the Cogan brothers here will take her. They'll take her, after they've skinned you, and after they've used her. And I'll still get her back, maybe a little damaged, but I've always been partial to breaking a wild filly." Rosalie felt the bile rise in her throat. Seth said nothing. He just sighted down the barrel of his rifle, his finger resting on the trigger. "No," Macklin sighed, a theatrical, disappointed sound. "I find that hard to believe. You're half Cheyenne. Your people are practical. They trade. I'm offering a trade. Her life for your convenience. No? Very well." His entire demeanor shifted. The soft, negotiating mask fell away, revealing the monster beneath. His eyes went cold and flat. "You've made your choice. Breed. You're a dead man, and she," he pointed a thick finger at the cabin, "will beg me to kill her before Amos and Eli are through with her. We'll be back at sundown. Enjoy your last day." He turned his horse, his movements calm, deliberate. The Cogan brothers followed, their eyes, one pair dead and watery, the other pair hot and animal-like, lingering on the cabin. They rode back into the trees and were gone. The silence they left behind was heavier, more terrible than the blizzard. "He's lying," Seth said, his voice quiet. Rosalie looked at him, confused. "What?" "He said sundown. He's lying." Seth moved away from the window, his movements quick, urgent. "He wants us to wait, to sweat. He'll attack when we don't expect it, in the middle of the day, or right now." He grabbed the heavy table and, with a grunt, shoved it against the door, reinforcing the bar. "He thinks we're stupid. He thinks we'll wait." The day dragged. The sun climbed high, a weak, pale disk in the sky. It grew warm in the cabin. The silence from outside was absolute. No birds, no squirrels, just the drip, drip, drip of melting snow from the eaves. "They're out there," Rosalie whispered, her voice hoarse. She was at the back, peering through a tiny crack. "They're just waiting." "I know." Seth was checking his loads. He handed her the small knife he'd used for skinning. "Put this in your boot. If he gets in, if he gets his hands on you, you know what to do." "Stab him," she said, her voice flat. "Aye, or yourself. Your choice. But don't let him take you." She looked at the small, sharp blade. She nodded, her face grim. She slid it into the top of her mended boot. The hours passed. 1 o'clock, 2. The waiting was a form of torture. A wire pulled tighter and tighter. And then, as the afternoon sun began to dip, the rain started. It wasn't a spring shower. It was a cold, hard, driving rain, a deluge of ice melt and misery that turned the clearing into a churning sea of mud. The world went gray. "Now," Seth said, his voice low. "What? Now? In the rain, the noise. He'll come now." And as if he'd summoned them, the first shot rang out. It didn't hit the cabin. It hit the roof. A thunk, followed by a clatter. "He's trying for the chimney," Seth growled. "Trying to block the smoke. Smoke us out." Another shot. A third. Then, from the back, a splintering crash. "The window!" Seth yelled, spinning. The thin Cogan brother, Eli, was using the butt of his rifle to smash the boarded-up back window. He was grinning, his long, yellow teeth visible. Seth raised his rifle, but at the same instant, 2 shots hammered the front door, the heavy slugs tearing through the wood, missing him by inches. Macklin and Amos pinning him. "Seth!" Rosalie screamed. Eli had broken through. He was climbing in, his eyes fixed on Rosalie, his grin widening. "Come to Papa, little bird." Seth turned, bringing his rifle to bear, but he was exposed. A shot exploded from the front, a bullet tearing through the wall, through the canvas of his new shirt, and into the meat of his left shoulder. He roared, a sound of pure rage and pain. Stumbling back, his rifle fired, but the shot went wide, into the ceiling. He was hit. Rosalie saw it all in a frozen, terrible instant. Seth, clutching his shoulder, blood darkening his shirt. Eli, halfway through the window, his eyes, his terrible, hungry eyes, on her. The fear was so great, it should have paralyzed her. But it didn't. It turned into something else, something cold. She raised the revolver, just as Seth had taught her. 2 hands. She pointed it at the center of Eli Cogan's chest, at the grinning, awful face. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the small cabin. It bucked in her hand, but she held on. Eli Cogan stopped. His grin froze. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his shirt, then up at her. His expression was not of anger. It was of pure, stupid surprise. He made a small, wet sound and fell backward, out of the window, disappearing. The front door exploded inward. Macklin, his face a purple mask of rage, was using Amos Cogan's bulk as a shield. The big man running low, the buffalo gun roaring. Seth shoved Rosalie. "Get down!" He fired his rifle from his hip, the shot grazing Amos's side. But the man was a bull. He crashed into Seth, the force of his charge sending them both to the floor, knocking Seth's rifle away. Macklin was in. He saw Rosalie, cowering, her revolver empty. "Mine," he hissed, his eyes wide. He lunged for her, grabbing her by the hair, and hauled her to her feet. He dragged her, screaming, out of the cabin, out into the churning, muddy rain. "I've got her! Amos!" he bellowed. "I've got my property! Kill the breed! Kill him!" He was dragging her toward the horses, his hand tangled in her hair, his other arm around her waist. She was fighting, kicking, her boots finding no purchase in the slick mud. "You'll learn." Macklin was panting, his face slick with rain. "By God, you will learn to obey me. I'll beat you every day. Arka!" Rosalie had driven her heel down, hard, on his instep. He stumbled, his grip on her waist loosening. It was all she needed. Her hand went to her boot. She pulled the knife. He had turned, his hand raised to strike her. She didn't hesitate. She lunged, driving the small, sharp blade into his thigh, burying it to the hilt. Macklin's scream was a high, thin sound, more animal than human. He staggered back, his hands flying to his leg, his eyes wide with disbelief. He fell, splayed in the thick, cold mud. Back in the cabin, it was a fight of brutes. Seth's shoulder was on fire, his arm useless, but his other hand, his knife hand, was free. Amos Cogan was on top of him. his massive, meaty hands groping for Seth's throat. The man smelled of whiskey and wet fur. Amos roared, slamming Seth's head against the floorboards. "Gonna tear your throat out! Breed!" Seth ignored the pain. He ignored the blood filling his own mouth. He brought his good arm up, the knife held low. He didn't have leverage to stab, so he just pushed. He put all his weight, all his rage, all his fear for Rosalie into that one upward thrust. The blade slid between Amos's ribs. Deep. The big man froze. He grunted, a sound of confusion, like a steer in a slaughterhouse. He looked down. He looked at Seth. He opened his mouth, but only blood came out. He pitched forward, dead weight, on top of Seth. Seth gasped, shoved the massive body off him. He got to his feet, his shoulders screaming, his vision swimming. He grabbed his rifle. He stumbled out the door, into the deluge. He saw Rosalie, on her knees in the mud, her face white. He saw Macklin, 10 feet away, trying to get to his feet, a knife handle sticking out of his leg. Macklin saw him. The saloon owner's face, which had been contorted in pain, filled with a new, final terror. He had no gun. He was wounded. He was facing a half-Cheyenne, blood-soaked, rifle in hand. "Wait!" Macklin shrieked, holding up his hands. "Wait, McCrae! Money! I'll give you everything. The saloon! $1,000! Mercy! Please!" Seth walked toward him. The rain was washing the blood from his shoulder, turning the mud at his feet a pale pink. He was not looking at Macklin's face. He was looking at his hands. His soft, pale hands. The hands that had struck Rosalie. The hands that had written stolen property. He stopped, standing over the man. Macklin was blubbering now, his eyes rolling, tears and rain mixing on his fleshy cheeks. "Mercy," he begged, the word a pathetic sob. Seth raised his rifle and, with his good hand, swung it. Not the barrel, the stock. He swung it, hard, against the side of Macklin's head, but it wasn't enough. It didn't feel like enough. He dropped the rifle. He lunged, his body, driven by a lifetime of rage, tackling the heavier man. They fell into the mud. Seth was on top. He was seeing the man who had cut his face. He was seeing the soldiers who had taken his mother. He was seeing the welts on Rosalie's back. He put his hands, his big, scarred, powerful hands, around Macklin's thick throat. Macklin clawed at him, his eyes bulging. He was gurgling, trying to scream, trying to beg. Seth just squeezed. He squeezed, his vision turning red. The sound of the rain, the world, his own pain, all of it fading, until there was nothing but the feel of the man's life ending beneath his fingers. He did not give mercy. The body went limp. Seth held on for a long, long time. He was still there, his hands locked, when the rain began to slow. He was covered in mud, in blood, his and theirs. He was a monster, a thing of the earth, an animal. "Seth!" Her voice. It cut through the red haze. He let go. He looked down at the purple, lifeless face, and felt nothing, just quiet. He pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest. His shoulder was a white-hot agony. He looked at his hands, caked in mud. He turned to her. She was still on her knees, staring at him, her face a mask of shock, her eyes wider than he'd ever seen them. She was looking at what he was, a killer. He walked to her. He knelt in the mud in front of her. He was shaking now, the adrenaline, the rage, all of it leaving him, leaving nothing but the cold and the pain. He reached out, his good hand, his clean hand, and touched her face. She didn't flinch. She just stared at him. He pulled her to her feet. He pulled her against him, his good arm wrapping around her, burying his face in her wet, tangled hair. He held her, and he just stood, the sole survivor, in a sea of mud and death. The aftermath was a blur. They stumbled back into the cabin, which was a wreck, blood, mud, and splinters. The wind whistled through the broken window. Rosalie, her shock breaking, began to tremble. It started in her hands and spread, a violent, uncontrollable shaking. Your shoulder," she stammered. her teeth chattering. He slumped into the chair. She got the water, the clean rags. She cut the shirt, his new shirt, her shirt, away from the wound. It was ugly. The bullet had gone clean through, but it had torn the muscle. Her hands, though they shook, were gentle. She cleaned it, her face pale. She found the laudanum he'd bought for her and poured some of it on the rag, pressing it to the wound. He grunted but didn't pull away. She bound it tightly with strips of cloth. When she was done, she stepped back, and she broke. She slid to the floor, her back against the cot, and she sobbed. It was not the weeping of before. It was a hard, dry, agonizing sound. "They're dead," she whispered, her hands tearing at her hair. "All of them. That man. I killed him. Oh, gods, Seth, I killed him." "He was going to kill you," Seth said, his voice a hoarse croak. "It's me," she cried, rocking back and forth. "It's my fault. I brought this. I brought them. The bounty hunters. Macklin. The Cogans. All this death. I cursed you." She looked up at him, her face a ruin of tears and guilt. "You saved me, and I've destroyed you. Look at you. You're... He got up from the chair, his whole body in agony, and he knelt in front of her. He took her face in his hands, his good hand and his wounded one, ignoring the pain. "Listen to me," he said, his voice fierce, cutting through her sobs. "You didn't curse me." He pressed his forehead against hers. "You're the only thing," he whispered, his voice cracking, "that ever gave me a future." She stared at him, her sobbing hitched. "My whole life," he said, "was just staying alive. There was no why, just don't die today. And then you fell out of the snow. And I had a why. You, Rosalie. You're my why." He pulled her up, and they held each other, two broken, bleeding things. In the ruins of their home, the rain stopped near midnight. The clouds broke, and a cold, pitiless moon shone down, silvering the mud, illuminating the bodies. "We can't stay," he said. His shoulder was throbbing, but his voice was clear. "This place, it's poison now." "What?" "What do we do?" "We clean up and we leave." It was a grim, terrible task. He, with his one good arm, and she, her small frame straining, dragged the bodies. Eli Cogan, Amos Cogan, Alistair Macklin. They dragged them one by one, into the trees, far from the cabin, near the two bounty hunters they had left. They didn't have the strength to dig, not in the cold, wet ground. They found a shallow defile, a washout, and they rolled them in. Seth, with his good arm, shoveled mud and rocks over them until they were gone. They didn't say a prayer. They just stood, two shadows in the moonlight, their breath pluming. They returned to the cabin. It was almost dawn. Seth walked to the hearth, where the bounty poster he'd ripped from the wall lay crumpled. He picked it up, and the other pieces he'd shoved in his coat. He looked at the words, "Stolen property, dead or alive." He threw them into the embers. They both watched as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The words disappeared. He turned to her. She was standing by the broken door, a small, lost figure in the wreckage. He walked to her, his steps heavy. He didn't say anything. He just wrapped his arms around her, his good arm and his wounded one, pulling her tight against his chest. He held her, as the first cold. Gray light of a new day broke over the mountain, and for the first time in his entire life, he wasn't alone. They didn't wait for the sun. They were gone before the gray light had fully touched the clearing, leaving the cabin, the broken window, the blood in the mud, and the 5 shallow graves in the trees. They left it all behind. They took the mule, Silas loading him with what little they could carry, a side of venison, the bag of flour and quinine Seth had bought, 2 rifles, all the ammunition, and a bedroll of furs. Seth's shoulder was a blazing, stiff agony, but he mounted the mule. Rosalie, her face pale and set, took the lead rope and walked. They didn't look back. They traveled north, into the high, broken country, away from any trail a man might follow. The first week was a silent, agonizing blur. Seth's wound, inflamed by the cold and the constant movement, gave him a fever. He would drift in and out of sense, his eyes bright and hard. Rosalie, who had felt so broken, found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She became the rock. She was the one who found the sheltered places to camp, who cleaned and rebound his wound, who fed him sips of water and laudanum-laced tea. She was the one who held his revolver at night, her back pressed against the mule for warmth, listening to the dark, her heart a cold, steady drum. She hunted using the snares he had taught her to catch, her hands no longer clumsy. She was surviving. She was making them survive. When his fever broke, on the 8th day, he woke to find her beside him, her face thin and smudged with dirt, her hair a wild tangle. She was asleep, her head on his good leg, the revolver still gripped in her hand. He lay there, watching her, his heart so full it felt like a new, separate wound. He saw the strength. He saw the woman she had become. He was humbled. They traveled for weeks. They crossed the spine of the mountains, a journey that should have been impossible, and descended into the great, empty plains on the other side. It was a new world. The sky was bigger, a pale, endless blue, and the wind never, ever stopped. It was a harsh, scouring wind that flattened the grass and tore at their clothes. They moved through dangerous valleys, the territory of men who lived outside the law. They hid from riders, spending 2 days in a rocky crevice, watching a band of rustlers pass. They clung to each other in the cold nights, their bodies a shared furnace. They no longer spoke of what had happened. There were no words for it. Their bond was not in words. It was in the way he would hand her the waterskin first, every time, no matter how parched he was. It was in the way her hand would rest, in the night, on his bad shoulder, as if guarding it. They found a small border town, nameless, sun-baked, and forgotten, clinging to the edge of a dry riverbed. It was not a town of hope, like Redemption Gap had pretended to be. It was a town of last chances. The people here, miners, ranchers, and women with hard eyes, were all running from something. They were not curious. They did not ask questions. A man with a scarred face and a healing shoulder, and a woman with old ghosts in her eyes, did not warrant a second glance. Here, Seth McCrae and Rosalie Thorne died. He walked into the land office, his face set, his hand on the knife in his belt. He laid $20 in gold coin, payment from the bounty hunter's purse, on the desk. "Claimin' land," he said to the tired-looking clerk. "Up north, by the creek, 200 acres. The clerk looked at the gold, then at Seth's face. He pushed a paper forward. "Name?" Seth paused. He looked at the ink pot. "Stiles," he said, his voice flat. "Jacob Stiles." "Wife?" the clerk asked, not looking up. Seth looked at Rosalie, who was standing by the door, her hand on the frame. She was watching him, her gaze steady. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "Wife, Sarah Stiles." They were married by a piece of paper and a lie, but it was the truest thing in his life. The land was 5 miles out of town. It was not pretty. It was hard. Wind-blasted prairie, with a thin, struggling creek and a single, stubborn cottonwood tree, but it was theirs. They lived in a lean-to of canvas and hides for the first month. They worked from the first light of dawn to the last fading streak of purple in the west. Seth, his shoulders slowly mending, began to cut sod. It was brutal, back-breaking work, slicing the earth, which was held together by a thick, matted web of prairie grass, into heavy bricks. Rosalie worked beside him. She hauled the sod, her arms, thin but now wiry with muscle, straining. She learned to mix mud and grass for the chinking. She was not a preacher's daughter. She was not stolen property. She was a pioneer. She was a builder. They built their home. It was not a log cabin, like the one in the mountains, a fortress of pine. It was a soddy, a house made of earth. It rose from the plains as if the land itself had given them shelter. It was one room, with a low roof, a packed dirt floor, and a small, precious glass window Seth had traded for in town. It was ugly, it was dark, and to them, it was a palace. The first night they slept inside, on their bed of furs on the clean-swept dirt. The wind howled outside, but it could not touch them. They were home. Life found its rhythm. Seth, now Jacob, found work breaking horses for a rancher south of town. He was good with them, his quiet, steady patience calming the wild animals. He brought home money, and with it, seeds. Rosalie planted. The earth was hard and unforgiving, but she was stubborn. She planted corn and beans and squash, and in a small patch by the front door, she planted the seeds of wildflowers she had gathered from the creek bank. She was planting beauty in a place that had none. Seth watched her. He had never known this. This building. This next day. His life had been about survival. Moment to moment. This was a future. He had no skill with wood, not fine wood, but he had his knife, and he had the cottonwood tree. He found a piece, cured it, and he began to whittle. For weeks, in the evenings, he worked, Roz daily, noticing his absence, took over the cooking, the mending. She found a quiet joy in the domestic tasks that had once been her prison. Now, they were a choice. She was not mending for Macklin. She was mending for her husband. One night, he came in, carrying something. He had built her a table. It was rough, the legs uneven, the top scarred with his clumsy axe work. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She ran her hand over the rough-hewn surface. She looked at him, her eyes shining. She didn't need to say anything. He began to build her a chair, to match. The seasons turned. The harsh summer baked the prairie brown, and the first hints of a cold, sharp autumn were on the wind. They had made it. They had survived. Rosalie had been working on something, too, in the quiet evenings. While he worked on her chair, she would sit by the fire, a small piece of cottonwood in her lap, his skinning knife in her hand. One evening, as they sat outside, watching the sun set, the sky a breathtaking blaze of orange and purple, she held it out to him. "I made you something," she said, her voice shy. He took it. It was a small, carved token. It was rough, like his table, the work of an amateur. But the shape was clear. It was a bird, its wings spread wide, breaking free from a tangle of carved lines that looked like thorns. He ran his thumb over the smooth, whittled wood. He understood. The preacher's girl. The little bird. He looked at her, his throat thick. "I used to think about what he said," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "That I would break. I thought I was in so many pieces, just shattered." She turned to him, her eyes clear, full of a love so deep it staggered him. "But you didn't see broken pieces. You saw me. You took all that sharpness, all that pain, and you just held it. You held me. You didn't break me." She put her small, calloused hand on his chest, over his heart. "You saved me." He couldn't speak. He pulled her to him, and his kiss was not one of hunger, or desperation, or fear. It was a kiss of gratitude. It was a kiss of peace. That night, they did not go inside. She spread their blanket on the grass, on the earth they had claimed, under the vast, open sky. The stars were a river of diamonds. So close, so bright, it felt like he could reach up and touch them. He lay on his back, and she came to him. She made love to him. It was not the desperate, frantic coupling of the cabin. It was not the slow, aching discovery of his body. It was a celebration. It was a homecoming. She was not afraid. She was not ashamed. She was his. He was hers. They moved together with a slow, sure rhythm, a perfect, quiet surrender. Under the stars, on their own land, they were completely, and finally, free. The months passed. The cold came. The one-room soddy, with its thick walls, was warm. They were happy. It was a quiet, hard-won happiness, a happiness that lived in small moments. The shared cup of coffee in the morning, The way he would touch her braid as he passed, the sound of her small, rare laugh. But the past was a wound, and wounds, even when they heal, leave scars. Rosalie had been quiet for a week. A shadow had returned to her eyes, a fear he had not seen since Redemption Gap. She was pale. She was sick in the mornings. He knew. He was a man of the wild. He knew the signs. He was just waiting for her. She finally broke one night. He was oiling his rifle, the cabin warm. She was sitting on the cot, just staring. "Seth," she whispered. He stopped, his hand stilling on the cloth. "Rosalie, I think I am—" She couldn't say it. Her hands were twisting in her apron. "I'm late, over a month." A tear, hot and sudden, rolled down her cheek. "Oh, gods, Seth, what if it's like him? What if it— I'm so scared. I don't know how. I'm my father's daughter. I have nothing. I'm Macklin's property. I'm cursed. The old fears, the old shame. It was all there, bubbling to the surface. A child. A child was a new terror, a new old world of pain and fear. Seth put the rifle down. He walked over to her. He knelt on the dirt floor. She was hunched over, her hands on her belly, as if to ward off a blow. She was weeping, her body shaking. "I'm so scared. Seth, I'm so scared. I'm all alone in this." He took her hands, her small, shaking hands, and pulled them away. He placed his own hand, his big, scarred, calloused hand, on her belly. He splayed his fingers wide, over her womb. He waited until her sobs quieted, until her eyes met his. His face was so serious, so tender. "You're not alone," he whispered. He leaned in, and he pressed his forehead against her belly. He stayed there, a silent, powerful guardian. Her sobs stopped. Her hand came up and rested on his head, her fingers twining in his long, black hair. She was not alone. The story closes. It does not close with a neat, happy bow. Life, out here, is not a neat, happy thing. We see them. Months later, it is summer. The wildflowers Rosalie planted are a riot of blue and yellow by the door. The cabin is still just one room, but it is a home. They are sitting on the porch Seth built, on two chairs, the one he made for her, and a matching one he made for himself. She is heavy with child, her body round, her face, though still thin, holding a new, soft glow. He is beside her, his rifle on his lap. He is not cleaning it. He is just watching. He is watching the wind as it rustles through his fields of corn, a green, living sea. Not all the wounds have healed. Her hands, when a horse rides by too fast on the trail, still clench. His bad shoulder still aches, a deep, throbbing pain. When the rain comes, and his eyes still scan the horizon, watching, always watching. The ghosts of Macklin and the Cogans, the ghosts of his mother and father, they are not gone. They are just quieter. The wind blows. Rosalie puts her hand on her belly. She smiles, a small, tired smile, and she leans her head just for a moment on his good shoulder. He does not flinch. He reaches over, his hand covering hers. They are not all right. They are not perfect, but they are together. And they chose each other. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment and say hello. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to From Wild West and be sure to share your thoughts in English. We're grateful to have you here.